All right, diving in today, folks. We're going deep on something pretty essential in our digital world, research ethics in the online space. It's a huge topic, and the rules of the game keep changing as the internet grows.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the Wild West out there in some ways. And with this deep dive, we really want to unpack the ethical dilemmas and the core principles, the things that should be shaping how we do research online. And to help us with that, we'll be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Internet research ethics.
I think for us as philosophers, this is especially fascinating, right? Because so many of the big ideas we grapple with, privacy, what consent really means, the whole public versus private thing, it's all being reshaped as research moves online. So we're going to dig into that, see where these lines blur and what it means for how we think about these concepts.
You hit the nail on the head. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it really gives us this great starting point, this detailed overview to really get into the nuances and honestly, the messiness of ethical research in the digital age.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly are we talking about when we say internet research ethics, IRE? Like, what's the working definition here?
Well, the most common definition, and this is right from the Stanford Encyclopedia, is that it's the analysis of ethical issues, all the tricky stuff, and then applying those good old research ethics principles, but specifically when the research happens on or uses the internet. It's a pretty broad definition, though, covers a whole lot of research.
Can you give us some examples? Like, what kind of studies would fall under this internet research umbrella?
Sure. Think of research that uses online tools to gather data. So online surveys, maybe interviews over video calls, things like that. But it also includes research that's looking at internet use itself. So how people behave online, how digital communities form, all of that. And then, of course, there's research that uses data sets you find online, could be public, could be private, all sorts of data out there.
Right. It's way more than just taking a paper survey and putting it online. The internet, it changes how research works at a fundamental level.
Exactly. And one of the key things to remember is the difference between the internet as a research tool and the internet as a research venue. So think of a search engine or that survey software we talked about. Those are tools researchers use, right? They help us do our work.
So find information, reach people, yeah.
Right. But research venues, those are different. That's the actual online space where research is happening, where the data is coming from. Could be social media platforms, online games, forums, even interactive websites, anything where research is taking place online. That's a venue.
So if you're using Twitter to recruit people for a study, that's a tool. But if you're studying, I don't know, how players form groups and interact inside a game world, that game is your venue.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
That's a really clear way to think about it. And then building on that, there's another useful distinction: engaged web-based research versus non-intrusive web-based research. So engaged research means you're directly interacting with people online.
So like a researcher joins a forum, maybe using a fake name to observe discussions or does interviews in a virtual reality space, stuff like that.
Exactly. Non-intrusive research, on the other hand, that's when you're analyzing data that's already out there without directly talking to people. Like if you're looking at blog posts that are public or studying patterns in website traffic, no direct interaction.
Okay, I get the difference. But the Stanford entry, it mentions that these lines are getting blurry. Why is that happening?
It's mostly because of how social media has evolved and all these third-party apps that work with them. Facebook, or X as it is now, they're kind of both tool and venue at the same time. Think about it. You can find participants with targeted ads, collect data through polls or messages, analyze what people are posting publicly, and even share your findings, all within the same platform.
Yeah, that definitely makes things more complicated, especially when you think about who owns the data, what those user agreements really mean, and like whose rules even apply in these online spaces.
Absolutely. The point is, when we use these third-party sites, researchers aren't the only ones making decisions about the data. We agree to these terms of service, right? And those terms can totally change how we think about privacy, consent, ownership, even which laws apply to the data.
And this isn't just a theoretical problem. Remember the Facebook emotional contagion study back in 2014? That really brought a lot of this to light.
Yeah, that was a big turning point. Facebook, they messed with people's news feeds, like on a huge scale, to see how it affected their emotions, and they didn't get explicit consent. It caused a big ethical debate. People were like, wait, just because you agree to a platform's terms, does that mean you're consenting to be researched on? It made everyone rethink how much ethical review these online studies need, whether you need to debrief people afterwards, and what the ethical responsibility is for companies doing research.
It really showed how the way these platforms operate, it can clash with how we usually think about research ethics. And speaking of ethics, the Stanford entry then goes into how internet research ethics connect to the whole field of human subjects research. The idea being that ethics are important for all research, no matter what methods or tech you're using.
That's so important to remember. The basics of ethical research, they don't change just because you're online. We have the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, talking about respecting people, being beneficial, being just. All of that still applies.
And in the U.S., we have the Common Rule, right?
Right, a common rule.
Yeah.
Officially, it's called 45 CFR Section 46. And it's basically a set of rules, along with similar ones in other countries, to make sure research is ethical. But as the Stanford entry points out, there's not a lot of guidance specifically about internet research, even though it's so common now.
So these rules we have, they weren't really made with the online world in mind.
Exactly. And even though the common rule was updated in 2017, they added some stuff, like broadening what counts as a human subject to include collecting information or biospecimens and focusing more on identifiable private information. They still didn't really give detailed guidance on how to handle internet research specifically.
And even the idea of identifiable private information, that's changing as tech gets more advanced, isn't it?
For sure. They actually put something in the revised rules saying that they're going to keep looking at what identifiable private information and identifiable biospecimens mean, because the ways we analyze data are getting so sophisticated, and it's getting easier to re-identify people even when data is supposed to be anonymous.
Which makes sense, right? It's crazy how easy it is to connect different bits of data online. The Stanford entry then talks about a shift from thinking about human subjects research to human harming research, especially when researchers aren't directly interacting with people. Can you explain what that means?
So the idea is that research can cause harm even if you're not directly working with participants. Like, let's say you're analyzing a huge data set. You could accidentally damage someone's reputation or cause informational harm if their data gets out, or if your research findings end up hurting a certain group, even if you never directly talk to those people. It's not just about how individuals experience being research subjects. It's about the broader harm that can come from research or the data it creates.
So even if you're looking at data that's supposed to be anonymous or aggregated, it could still end up hurting someone if they're re-identified or if the overall conclusions are bad for a community.
Yeah, exactly. And this also makes us rethink how we define personally identifiable information, or PII, in these new online spaces, like avatars and virtual worlds. As Fairfield and others have argued, an avatar isn't just some random image. It represents a person's online identity, and that can be linked back to real-life information.
This all points to the need for a more sophisticated and constantly evolving understanding of ethics as research moves online. So let's look at some of the key ethical issues that the Stanford entry talks about, starting with privacy. This one seems particularly tricky online.
Oh, it definitely is. The basic idea, of course, is to protect people's privacy and keep their data confidential. We know there can be serious harm if privacy is breached, but online, it's really hard to define and ensure privacy. Data can be linked and re-identified so easily, and it often starts with information that seems totally harmless.
The examples in the entry are pretty wild, right? Things like zip codes, the stuff people search for online, even their movie ratings. All of that has been used to figure out who people are in data sets that were supposed to be anonymous. Makes you wonder what anonymous even means anymore.
Totally. It shows just how hard it is to be truly anonymous online. There's a difference between confidential data, where you take out identifying information, but there's still a way to link it back to a person, and anonymous data, where any connection is completely gone. And a lot of research has shown that true anonymity online is getting harder and harder.
And then there's the whole debate about IP addresses, right? Whether they count as PII seems to depend on who you ask and where you are.
Exactly. The GDPR, the EU's big data protection law, says IP addresses are personal data. But in the U.S., it's not so clear-cut. Although Buchanan and others pointed out that in the U.S., for IPA, the healthcare privacy law, IP addresses are treated like PII. But the point is there's no global standard, which makes things even trickier for researchers working internationally.
So what about the definition of private information itself? We used to think of it as information that people expect won't be observed or recorded without their knowledge, and that if they share it, it won't be made public without their consent. But how does that work online, where practically everything we do is recorded and tracked?
That's the big question. Some researchers argue that people have less of an expectation of privacy online, since websites and companies are tracking us all the time. But research has also shown that a lot of people don't really understand how all this tracking works, and they don't really get those super long and complicated privacy policies. Like, there's this study by Huxon and Bruckman where they looked at online chat rooms and found that people thought those spaces were pretty private, even intimate, but in reality they were often public and archived.
So the context of the online space really matters. What might be public in one place could be considered private in another.
Exactly. Researchers like Rosenberg, who's looked at virtual worlds, they say it's crucial to understand the social norms and relationships in a specific online community before assuming that information shared there is public. It's all very ambiguous, which makes it really tough for researchers and for IRBs to apply those traditional ideas about private information online.
And then you have social media, which are these super complex spaces where people share a ton of personal stuff, but they often don't totally understand their privacy settings or how the platform uses their data.
Right. Technically, a lot of what's posted on social media is public, but just because you're sharing it with friends or followers doesn't mean you're automatically okay with researchers scraping and analyzing that data for some study you might not even know about. People might not get all the details in those terms of service, or they might not realize that changes to the platform could make their data more visible than they thought.
This brings us back to what Ohm said, that there's this trade-off between data being useful and data being private. The more useful a data set is for research, the more likely it is to have information that could be used to re-identify people.
Exactly. As internet research keeps advancing and we get better at analyzing data, those old ideas about privacy are becoming less and less clear. So, as Nissenbaum suggests, we need to think about privacy in a more nuanced way, depending on the specific context. And we need to be more careful and ethical about protecting privacy online.
Okay, let's move on to another big ethical question. Recruiting people for online research. How do researchers find participants in these digital spaces without being unethical?
There are tons of ways to recruit online, like using social media ads, those push and pull techniques, sending emails, posting on websites or forums, even, in some cases, scraping public data to find potential participants. But no matter how you do it, the basic ethical principles of being fair, choosing people without bias, and making sure the risks and benefits are distributed justly, all of that still applies. But online, it's not always easy to stick to those principles.
Because a lot of online interactions are anonymous, and it's hard to be sure about someone's age or demographics.
Exactly. People use fake names, have multiple accounts, it gets complicated. And ethically, researchers have to protect potential participants' privacy, even during recruitment.
So you can't accidentally reveal someone's identity or the fact that they might be in a study just by contacting them.
Exactly. The standard entry also talks about how researchers have to follow the rules of any platform they use for recruitment and get permission from moderators before posting anything in certain online spaces. It's about respecting those communities and how they work.
And we have to be careful about what's called research spam, right? Sending tons of unwanted survey invites or study ads is not only annoying, it's ethically wrong.
For sure. Being too pushy or intrusive can feel like harassment, and it can also mess up your study's results. The goal is to give potential participants enough information so they can decide whether or not to join the study, and that information needs to be clear and easy to understand.
Which leads us to informed consent, which is so crucial for ethical research. The traditional way we think about consent, that ongoing conversation and agreement between the researcher and the participant, that's harder to do online.
It really is. The whole nature of the internet makes it hard to have that face-to-face back-and-forth relationship that we usually have with consent. While IRBs might waive consent in some cases or let you change things up a bit, most of the time you have to adapt the consent process to the online world.
The Stanford entry mentions some alternative consent methods that people have tried, like consent portals, chunked consent, and using cards or tokens, especially in online games and virtual worlds. Can you explain how those work?
Sure. A consent portal is basically a web page with all the info about the study, what it's for, what'll happen, the risks, the benefits, and participants have to say they've read and understood it before they can join. Chunked consent means you break the information into smaller pieces and participants confirm they understand each part before moving on. Consent cards or tokens are more visual, like in a virtual world or game. They show other players and the researchers that a person knows about the study and has agreed to be part of it.
And when you need documented consent, a lot of researchers use electronic signatures.
Right. Electronic signatures, it could be clicking a box or using a more secure digital signature. It's a way to show that someone has officially consented. But the legal rules for electronic signatures, they can be different depending on where you are. But the main thing is, no matter how you get consent, the content of those consent forms, it has to be changed to address all the ethical issues that come up online.
Like, you have to tell people how long you'll keep their data, the privacy risks of collecting data online, who will have access to it, and you have to make it clear that the study's consent process is separate from whatever terms of service the online platform has.
Exactly. People need to know about the risks to their data's security and privacy, where it'll be stored, which is especially important if you're using the cloud, and who else might see it, not just the research team. And researchers have to explain what they're doing to protect the data, like using encryption and secure storage.
The entry mentions certificates of confidentiality, or COSICs, which are sometimes used for research funded by the NIH. They give legal protection to researchers and participants in the U.S., but they don't always work internationally, which is a big deal since the internet is global.
Very true. Research data can easily cross borders, and a COSIC from the U.S. might not mean anything in another country. And getting proper consent in international research is tricky because of different cultures and laws.
And now there's this push for open data, sharing research data so it's transparent and reproducible, so consent forms need to address that too.
Absolutely. The consent process has to fit with how you plan to share data, explaining how it'll be stored, who might get access, and if it can be reused, all while protecting people's privacy and intellectual property.
In the U.S., we generally think that you don't always need individual consent for publicly available data like posts on X or Twitter as it was. But the Occupy thing back in 2016, that showed how ethically tricky it can be even with data that's technically public, didn't it?
Yeah, that was a big one. A researcher scraped a bunch of data from Occupy, almost 70,000 users, and shared it, saying it was public so no consent was needed. But a lot of people said it was unethical, it wasn't transparent, the information was really personal and could identify people, and users probably didn't expect their data to be used that way. It's a good reminder that just because something is public doesn't mean you can ethically use it for research without thinking carefully about the context, potential harm, and what users expect.
The Stanford entry even has an example of what to say in consent forms when you're using on-long tools hosted in the U.S., specifically mentioning the Patriot Act and how it could affect data access. Researchers need to be really aware of these details.
Absolutely. Being upfront about where data will be stored and what laws apply is crucial for getting informed consent, especially for international research.
Let's talk about research with minors now and how to get consent or assent from them. This seems even more complicated ethically.
It is. Verifying age online and getting parental consent, it's a minefield. The rules are different everywhere, and what counts as a minor isn't always the same. In the U.S., the common rule says a child is anyone under 18, and you need permission from parents or guardians before they can be in a study.
The entry also says that for clinical research under the common rule, kids 7 and older usually have to give their assent too, right?
Right, because we recognize that they're starting to understand things and can agree to participate. And in Australia, there's this idea that sometimes getting parental consent could actually hurt the child, so it's not always clear-cut.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution for getting consent from or for minors online. Researchers have to consider the context, the risks and benefits, and the rules in their area. The entry also talks about ways to verify age online.
Yeah, there's age-gating software, asking people to self-report their age, knowledge-based checks, and confirming age multiple times during the process. Researchers and IRBs need to be creative and careful when deciding how to handle consent with minors, considering if they can waive consent in low-risk situations or what procedures to use for getting parental permission, all based on the type of data they're collecting.
Another thing that adds ethical complexity to the BICS is cloud computing. It's super useful for research, but it raises a whole new set of concerns.
Definitely. The cloud is great for finding participants, storing data, processing it, collaborating with other researchers, all that. But when you're relying on these third-party systems, you have to really think about privacy and security.
If you're storing sensitive data on someone else's servers, you need to trust their security and understand who else might have access to that data, accidentally or not.
Exactly. You have to worry about unauthorized access, make sure the data is encrypted, and really understand the cloud provider's terms of service. Researchers are responsible for taking care of the data, and that gets trickier when it's spread out across different data centers around the world, each with its own laws. And the provider's terms might even give them rights to the data that you didn't expect or tell participants about.
And then there's crowdsourcing, which is great for certain tasks, but also comes with ethical and methodological challenges.
Totally. When you're using a bunch of people online to collect or analyze data, You have to think about privacy, potential bias, whether the results are reliable, and even how to fairly compensate and credit the people doing the work.
The Stanford entry also talks about big data and how using algorithms to analyze it can lead to what's called algorithmic harms.
Yeah, algorithms are super powerful for analyzing big data, but they can also cause problems. Reports from groups like the National Science and Technology Council have shown that these analytical algorithms can mess with privacy, lead to biased or wrong decisions, lack transparency, and even discourage people from doing things online if they think they're constantly being watched.
And big data research, it's so massive and complex that it can create what the philosopher James Moore called conceptual muddles, making it really hard for IRBs and ethicists to understand the ethical issues involved.
Exactly. Those traditional ways of protecting privacy, like anonymizing data and only collecting what's necessary, they don't work as well with these huge data sets that are often scraped from the internet. It becomes much harder to define private information and decide when you absolutely need consent.
And it's tricky because we don't always know what people intend or expect when they share things online. Just because it's public doesn't mean they want it to be used for research, especially research they don't know about.
That's a key point. The Facebook Emotional Contagion study showed that using a platform's terms of service as an excuse for not getting consent in big data research is ethically questionable. And when you use big data to train AI and machine learning, you have to be very careful about bias, fairness, accountability, and transparency. The way you collect data can have a big impact, especially on vulnerable groups.
Lastly, the Stanford entry talks about the ethics of internet research done by companies, which often isn't subject to the same kind of ethical review as academic research.
Yeah, companies are always collecting and analyzing data, doing experiments, all that, and it often affects our personal lives in a big way. But unlike in academia, where research usually goes through IRB review, companies don't always do that unless they're working with a university or something.
That lack of oversight can be risky for people's privacy, autonomy, and well-being, and it can also hurt the company's reputation and get them in legal trouble, especially if they're using data in ways that weren't originally intended. Getting true, informed consent for all the ways data might be used in the future is practically impossible.
For sure. Some big tech companies, like Meta, they've made their own internal ethics review processes, but even those have been criticized for not being transparent enough, for not really prioritizing ethics in their decisions, and for the conflict between doing the right thing and making money.
So it's clear that internet research ethics are super complex and keep changing as tech advances. It's good that the Stanford entry mentions how more and more research ethics boards and universities are making specific guidelines for internet research. At least people are starting to recognize these challenges and trying to help researchers figure things out.
Definitely. We don't have one set of rules for internet research ethics yet, but the examples in the entry from places like Bard College, Loyola University Chicago, Penn State, the UK Data Archive, UC Berkeley, and the University of Connecticut, they show that researchers and IRBs are working on it.
So as philosophers, this deep dive into internet research ethics, using the Stanford Encyclopedia as our guide, it shows how some of our most basic concepts are being challenged. The online world is different, and it makes us rethink those traditional ethical ideas about privacy, consent, and what's public versus private.
Absolutely. And with technology changing so fast, we need to keep talking about these things, thinking critically, and adapting our ethical principles to keep up with the digital world.
So here's something for our listeners to ponder. As the lines between public and private online get blurrier and data collection becomes more and more common, what does it mean for individual autonomy and the ethical responsibilities of both researchers and the companies making the tech we use? Think about the deeper philosophical ideas behind privacy and consent in this digital age. It's something we all need to grapple with.
And if you want to learn more about all of this, we highly recommend checking out the full entry on internet research ethics in the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy and all the other resources they mention. It's a great starting point for further reflection.